Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech Ha'olam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'nasan Lanu Es Toraso Baruch Ata Adonai Nosein HaTorah Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. All right. Busy week, I'm sure, for all of us. Incredible journeying to Rosh Hashanah coming in 2 weeks. You're ready or not, here it comes. Just 1 second. There's a lot of work to do, a lot of things always happening. So it's really great for people that can like step away from it all and say, I want to learn. I want to focus. I want to connect to my heritage. And learning about our people is a great way to really understanding the past, to know how to do and function in the present and create the future of Mashiach. So we were discussing last week the post-Chanukah story. We sort of concluded the story of Chanukah, which of course was difficult but very glorious, and the tremendous miracles that God did for us then. And then we went into the post-Chanukah story, which unfortunately was rather tragic. And we explained that the family of the Chashmonaim, Matisyahu had 5 sons, and 4 out of the 5 died during all of the 26 some years of wars to free the Jews of the Syrians. And yet, these people who risked their lives, who freed us of the Syrians, who experienced such miracles, 26 years of miracles in the battlefield, the miracle of Chanukah, the finding of the oil, the burning of it for 8 days, the restoration of Jewish independence that hadn't been independent since the destruction of the first temple. Their family line was horrifically tragic, as we began discussing last week. It lasted 103 years, and at the end, every single member of the family was killed. There is no one today who is a descendant of the Chashmonaim, not one person, because every single member of their family was killed, besides one girl who suicided. That was the end of the line. What in the world? How did people like this, what happened? And we explained that there was a very tragic mistake that they made. And I think it's a really significant point to understand this because, life is very complex. People are very complex. And, like we like to paint it as the whites and the blacks. And it's totally not like that. The Maccabees, Matisyahu and his sons, they were the whites of the whites. They were the knights in shining armor. They rescued the Jewish people. Obviously, God could have done it a different way, but if we want to look at it, how it played out, in their honor, the Jews escaped Antiochus and his decrees, and it was a fight for Torah Judaism. It was a fight to restore God's honor. It wasn't that the Syrians were killing the Jews that were listening to them and absorbing the Syrian culture. They were killing the Jews that were serving God. So this was a purely for God fight. And yet, their descendants totally left service of God. Their descendants murdered the sages, murdered the Jews that were serving God, and ultimately all their descendants were wiped out. And we see that because, as we discussed, they made this fatal mistake. And the fatal mistake was that when they conquered Jerusalem and restored the temple, and did all those miracles, the miracles of Chanukah, finding the oil, the oil burning for 8 days, at that point, that was a critical moment. We have restored peace. Again, we said last week there were 2 different historical versions of the story. None of us were there, and historians are not sure which way it went. Either it was a year into the fighting that the miracle of Chanukah happened and there was 25 more years of fighting, or it was at the very end of all 26 years. But in either case, at that moment, when we conquered Jerusalem, when we conquered the temple, when we are in control, the leader of the Maccabees, who was Yehuda, should have turned to the sages and say, okay, at this point, appoint a leader of the Jews from the house of David, because that's God's will. Now, we're not blaming him at all. I'm not at all. because it's incredibly difficult, especially, again, assuming this happened at the end, and you've been leading the Jews for 26 years. You've been fighting the battles for 26 years. All of your family, four out of your five brothers, if we're going at that point when the only surviving person was Shimon, have died in the battles. Only in the physical plane, in your honor, were the Jews saved. And now you say, oh, where's that King of David hiding under a rock somewhere? He must be somewhere. Yeah, he was protecting himself for the past 25 years as we all died in battle. Let him come and take the throne. Obviously, it wasn't the popular wish. They all revered the Chashmonaim, and it would require incredible nullification of self at that critical moment to do the will of God. But guess what? That would have led to their dynasty's illustrious reign forever. Reign in a spiritual sense, reign as a high priest. They were the priests, which is another reason why, besides the fact that the king can only come from Judah and from David and only from his son Solomon. Besides that, their function was to be the priests. They weren't supposed to be the warriors. They weren't supposed to be involved in the political arena. They weren't supposed to be involved in the physical running of the country. They were supposed to be the spiritual heads. And they could have remained the high priest forever, having descendants and descendants and descendants, loyal, godly people. So sometimes when it seems like at this moment I should give up everything that we were the ones that fought for, but honestly, sometimes when you make those hard choices and you do what God wants, so it seems so ridiculous at this point to do this. It seems so difficult. It seems so like going against everything your mind is telling you. This is really the best, not just for God, it's the best for you. If they had done this, they would have guaranteed their line's spiritual and physical superiority forever. And instead, their line was wiped out 103 years later after totally spiritually destroying everything the Maccabees had accomplished. So I just thought it's such an amazing, like we said, we look at the past to understand the present and create the future. It's such an amazing message for us that sometimes God demands things that are very difficult. And I can't imagine, it's an incredible, difficult thing. I'm saying it's truly unbelievably difficult to imagine someone passing such a test. Fight with self-sacrifice, save the Jews for 26 years, and then turn it over to somebody who was hiding this whole time. But guess what? This is what was God's will. And even if it's difficult, what God wants is that we should do his will. And I'm adding that if they had done this, this probably would have guaranteed their line forever. And instead, their line suffered spiritual destruction that against everything the Maccabees fought for, and physical destruction. So sometimes when God's will seems really tough and really hard, and he really wants that from me, and he really expects me to do that, and how in the world could God could even ask me to do something like this? God says, I know you and I love you. And yes, this is my will. And yes, this is the best for you. Trust me. This is the best for you spiritually, and this is the best for you physically. So that's a very powerful message we get from here. So, but Yehuda Maccabee, Judah, if it was the original story most of us envision, that the miracle of Chanuka happened 25 years before the fighting ended, at that moment, he should have turned over the reign. He did not. And so even though they continued and they fought and they sacrificed and they died for God, 4 of the 5 brothers died, but their rule, if we're calling it rule then, was sort of illegitimate because God wanted to be from the house of David, the son of Solomon. So we said last week that by the time all these wars are over, there was only one son remaining. Now the truth is, it was, whatever, I mean, there's many details, but the final son remaining was Shimon, was Simon. And his rule was, he was coming, his brother. At the end of the fighting, there were 2 sons remaining, Yonasan and Simon. Unfortunately, under Yonason's, the other 3 brothers had already passed away, and all of them had gone for God. Elazar was the first one. He was killed in Beit Tzor's battle. He thought there was an elephant. Elephant were the tanks of those days. He thought that was the general, the chief general on it, in such a highly decorated, or maybe he thought it was the king himself, in such a highly decorated elephant. So he literally died to kill him. He went under the elephant and stabbing it. So of course the elephant fell and crashed and killed him. It was not the king or the highest general. It was someone very significant, but that was the first of the 5's death. Judah died defending Jerusalem, one of the battles defending Jerusalem. Yochanan died under the Bedouins, who were, again, there was not only fighting the Syrians, or as I explained last time, there were all the little nations, all the people, the Gentile people all around that were very unhappy with the Jews gaining supremacy in this place, so they were attacking them also. So Yochanan died with the Bedouin attack. Yonasan was the 4th brother left, and he basically, at that point, the Jewish strength was so weakened that he had to go back to the original, like, guerrilla tactics of the original Chashmonaim some 25 years before, hiding and coming out and hiding and coming out, because they were so small. But gradually, Yonasan built up the Jewish army. And then what was happening, as I explained, was the Syrian kings were having plenty of problems of their own. And Demetrius, who was the king, there was a coup, there was an attempt to take over of Demetrius's reign, which made Demetrius and the Syrians very busy. And so he took advantage of this. He took control of Jerusalem. He renewed the service of the temple. He proclaimed himself the high priest. And again, Syria's falling apart. So as they're falling more and more apart, Yonasan is getting more and more successful. But it in the end fell apart. Again, now we're up to Demetrius' son, Demetrius II, who's reigning in Syria. And when an usurper tried to take over the throne, he took over. He's marching towards Jerusalem. He's going to conquer the temple. He's going to take everything over. And actually, Yonasan marches against him with his powerful army. And Yonasan's army is so powerful, this usurper to the Syrian throne, Tryphon said, oh, yeah, we'll make peace. Come, let's meet and make peace. And when Yonasan came to meet peace, Tryphon murdered him. So that was the death of the 4th son of Matisyahu. And now we have 1 son left. Yonasan was there for 17 years. Now we've got the last son left. The last son was the least military of all the sons. Shimeon, he was really, I don't say the scholar of the family of high priests, or at least a priest. It's sort of debatable if there was a family of high priests or priests, but definitely a very noble priestly family. And he was the least one involved in the wars, but he was the last one left. And the Jews turned to him. You know, his brother had been doing it for 17 years. Before that, his other brothers. He's the last one left. So he took Yonasan's place as the leader of Judea. And he said, you know, now since Tryphon had murdered Yonasan, if the names are confusing you, please stop me. You know, I could talk and talk and talk and talk, and you could be like, I don't know what she's saying. So please, you can always unmute yourself. You can always ask questions. I'm just going on assuming this is perfectly clear. It might be perfectly unclear. So again, we're saying that in Syria, Syrians, one way that God helped us win ultimately our independence was Syria kept having their own problems. And when they had their own problems, we got stronger because they couldn't deal with us. And here at the end, there was this conflict between the son of Demetrius, the Syrian leader, Demetrius II, and Tryphon. Tryphon sort of claimed the throne, as Demetrius is also claiming the throne. They're both claiming the throne. Tryphon had marched to Jerusalem, lost sort of in battle, proclaimed peace with Yonasan, and murdered him. Now Yonasan is gone. The last son is taking over, Simon. And Simon right away says, hey, we're for Demetrius. Look what Tryphon just did to my brother. Judea, the Jews, we side with Demetrius. Whatever it was worth, we side with Demetrius. Now Demetrius II here, was having so many difficulties. He was so appreciative that Simon said Judea sides with Demetrius that he says, I grant you complete freedom. And that is how in the end, after these 25 plus years of fighting, we became completely free of Syria. Because of the conflict between the two, because of Tryphon's treachery in assassinating Yonasan, And Simon saying, therefore, we're with Demetrius II. Never mind how horrible this line has been to us, but compared to what Tryphon did, we're with Demetrius. Demetrius said, you're with me, I'm with you. Judea, I give you complete independence. You are now.
Cyril, hi. Question.
Sure.
Okay, so Demetrius was king of Syria.
Demetrius is actually, is what I'm saying, Demetrius II, he was the king of Syria. Yes.
Okay. Actually, question, was the Syria at that time also was called Syria? The name of the country was Syria at that time?
I don't know. In all of the books I've ever looked at, they always call it Syria. I don't know if it had a different name then. But
so Dmitri, it sounds like is it a Greek name? Is it?
It was a Greek name because the whole point of all of these Syrians, when we say the story of Chanuka, right? A good question, Chava. And again, for anyone that this is not clear to, when we speak of the story of Chanuka, we always speak of our victory over the Greeks, right? The Hellenist culture, the Greeks, the ones that want to push on us the Greek culture and to toss away belief in God, the Greeks who love the Olympics and the anything that developed the body and worshiping the mind and taking out the godliness. Technically, when we say the Greeks, those Greeks were Syrians. As we've explained quite a while before, going back already 100 years, when Alexander the Great, he was the first one to conquer the world and spread the Greek culture. When he came to Judea, he also conquered it, so to speak. He conquered it from the crumbling Persian Empire. But he didn't force us to take on the Greek culture because of that great miracle that happened then with him and Simon the Tzaddik.
Right.
But from that point, that's when the Greek culture, now again, Alexander the Great was Greek, Macedonian, Greek. He's bringing the Greek culture to Judea. He died very shortly after. All of these great world conquerors have very short lifespans, very bloody control. When he died, his empire, which was the world at that time, got split among his generals. So originally, we were under the Egyptian rule, the Ptolemies of Egypt. And then infighting and, fighting between all the different, dynasties that had taken over, switched us, nothing that we did. We were just like pawns here, switched our country from being under the Egyptians to being under the Syrians. But the Egyptians that we were under were Greek Egyptians because they were all adherents and promoters past, with more sugar or with more swords of the Greek culture. And the Syrians that got us from the Egyptians, they were even more aggressively, because we said Antiochus, the first Antiochus of the story of Chanuka, Antiochus Epiphanes, he was not just a Greek lover, he was crazy. And I mean, that was assumed historically and at the time by everyone besides him probably. And he was obsessively like, I have to bring the Greek culture to the world. So yeah, Demetrius is a Greek name, as are Ptolemy, as are all these names, because all these people, even though these are Egyptians and these are Syrians, they had all absorbed the Greek culture. So the Greeks that were trying to get us to become Greek weren't in Greece. First they were in Egypt, and then they were in Syria. In Egypt, the Ptolemies did promote the Greek culture, but they didn't do it by sword. We said the worst thing that happened under the Ptolemies, which was a horrible thing, and again, it's a Greek thing, even though literally it's not by an Egyptian leader, was the translating of the Torah into Greek, the Septuagint. And that we said was a travesty because it was under Ptolemy, who again he's an Egyptian leader, but he's really Greek-headed. And he's saying, wow, Greeks, we love learning. This is a brilliant body of knowledge we want to absorb. Forget about the God part. We just want the knowledge part, which is why it was such a travesty. So yes, Demetrius is a Greek name, and he was Syrian. And the whole Hanukkah battles, all these 26 years, are with Syrians that are promoting and pushing aggressively, militarily, the Greek culture.
Got it. So they were they were Arabs. they just assumed Greek culture, or there were Greeks who came from Macedonia and lived in Egypt and Syria, or there were actual Arabs.
The leaders were probably actually originally Greeks, because all the leaders were the generals of Alexander, meaning, so when Alexander died, his generals split up his empire. So the original generals aren't Egyptian and aren't Syrian, they're all Greek. But, you know, we view them as Egyptian, the Ptolemies of Egypt, because, you know, that original general, Egypt was the hub of his empire, and he's now the Egyptian Greek ruler. And so with the Syrians, it was originally, whoever was the original name, probably was something like Antiochus, but I'm not going to swear to it, that original general that took over, again, the hub being Syria and all the surrounding areas, was, of course, a Greek general, but he's ruling the Syrian empire. So we view them as Syrian Greeks. So usually, historically, when we speak, of course, about Hanukkah, we say it was the Syrian Greeks, and that's what we mean by that term. Anyone else? Because I know I was racing and throwing out a lot of names. Okay, so we have at this moment, so again, we spoke about the tragedy of the mistake, who, again, depending on historically how you're understanding when the miracle of Hanukkah happened, might have been with Judah, because it might have been 25 years earlier when he conquered Jerusalem and conquered the temple and cleansed it, and there was a miracle of Hanukkah, and that was a pivotal moment when he should have turned to the sages and said, okay, we're in control. Of course, we have 25 years more fighting, but he didn't know that. Appoint a king from the house of David. Or maybe it didn't happen then, and maybe it was truly with Simon, with Shimeon, because that could have been only at the end of the road is when they actually really conquered Jerusalem, cleaned out the temple, are now ruling, and then Simon should have turned to the sages and said, okay, here, you know, we did it, we sacrificed, we're servants of God, we're the priests, we're going to go back to the temple and appoint a king from the house of David. And again, we are not at all, and I want to say that like for the 5th time or so, we're not at all judging them. It was an incredible test, but I just am pointing it out because I want us to learn the lesson from it. And the lesson is, even when it's really, really, really hard, the only thing that works is when you serve God. The only thing that works in the physical plane and the only thing that works in the spiritual plane is when you serve God. And I sincerely hope that that fatal mistake in no way wiped away any of their merits, and that they all have a luminous portion above, and they definitely deserve it. But that explains the tragedy of what happened to their descendants so quickly afterwards. Like, we're not talking about 500 years. We're talking about 103 years later, their line is wiped out. And right away, their children and grandchildren go the antithesis of what they sacrificed their lives for, that it's so bizarre if you don't put it in this context. So Simon, again, going back to the historical scene, so we had Yonasan, the 4th of the 5 sons of Matisyahu. Again, I'm saying the 4th in terms of who's left. I don't know their age order. But Yonasan, who was murdered by Tryphon. Tryphon and Demetrius II are in this conflict over who's truly ruling the throne. They both are claiming they are. And Simon, who then becomes the leader, says, we're with Demetrius. After what Tryphon did, we have no question. I mean, we hate both of them, but we're with Demetrius. And Demetrius said, I give you complete independence, which was a pretty big thing, because at this point, there was a lot of, it wasn't like so simple that like, oh, we ruled the country. We really didn't. It was a very tenuous reign, and with a very weak, army compared to, again, it was just miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle on God's part that we truly got to that point. But that's what happened. Now, Simon ruled for 7 years, and Simon was good. Like, unlike everyone that followed him, we're not going to say anything about Simon. He stayed loyal to Torah. He stayed loyal to the sages. He stayed loyal to God. He followed in his family's legacy, but he died a horrible death, which again goes back to, why would God do this to him? His brothers all died in battle. He's the king. He didn't take the name king, which of course none of them should take the name king, and he understood not to take the name king, but he was the king. He died a horrible death. his son-in-law murdered him and his 2 sons. He had 3 sons, and his son-in-law, wanting to take the throne after 7 years after they freed themselves from all the battles with the Syrians, now his son-in-law behaving in a completely Gentile way, exactly as per all the Gentile kings were going through, as we see. This one has a coup, and this one has a coup, and this one's overthrown, and this one's killed. Now his son-in-law is doing the same thing. His son-in-law had a Greek name, so we can imagine he was, as we called it, a Hellenist, a Greek sympathizer. He was Ptolemy, and he murdered him. There was one son that escaped, Yochana Horkanus. Yochana Horkanus heard about the plot, tragically was not able to save his father or brothers, but he escaped, and therefore Ptolemy did not get what he wanted, to be the king, to be the ruler, because Yochana Horkanus was able to come in and take over control, because obviously he had the people's support. So again, that was so tragic. Wait, if you don't get killed by the Syrians, you get killed by your own son-in-law with your 2 sons? Like, what a horrible, horrible end. And again, Simon did not do anything. Unlike unfortunately all of his descendants, Simon stayed loyal to the sages for the entire 7 years of his reign. But we go back to this critical, tragic mistake of not giving the throne back to David's descendants, even though it seemed hard, even though it seemed ridiculous, even though it didn't seem right, even though why is it fair when they've done nothing and we've been sacrificing for 25 years and all my brothers died because of this, and only because of our family's merit are we independent. It doesn't make a difference. In the end of the day, you got to do God's will, and that's the only road, and that's honestly the best road for us. Even if it seems like it's not a fair road and not a good road, it's the best road. It's the only road. And again, when you think of everything they did, and this is how God treated him, but then when we think of what happened, it sort of makes sense of this tragedy. So that's what happened with Simon. Ptolemy was not actually killed by Yochana Horkanus. He did manage, he ran away. So Ptolemy, 7 years after Simon took over, is trying to be just like the Gentile kings were at that time, and I'm going to murder my father-in-law, murder all my brother-in-laws, and I'm going to be the ruler. Yochana Horkanus escaped, survived, drove him out, he fled, but that was the end of Simon. That's how Simon died, and that was how 2 of his sons, he had 3 sons, and 2 of his sons died that way. So now we have Yochana Horkanus, who Yochana Horkanus, as we said, was very righteous, and in the final year of his life flips out and becomes a horrific. The term used for these people were tzedukim. Maybe I should just backtrack before I go into more history and explain these terms, because we're going to be using these terms the whole time, or these are the 4 groups. At this time, to understand the dynamics of what was happening among the Jewish people, we could divide the Jewish people into 4 groups. The majority of the Jews were called Perushim. That's the Hebrew term for them, the Perushim. In English, they're called the Pharisees, but in Hebrew, they're called the Perushim. Sometimes they're called the Chaverim, the friends, the Perushim. Parush means separate. Again, in English, I think it's pronounced the Pharisees, but in Hebrew, the term for it is Perushim. Parush, separate. This refers to the majority of the Jewish people who were loyal to Torah, who were loyal to the sages. So the sages are the Chaverim, the friends, the leaders, the spiritual leaders, and de facto the real leaders of the Jews, and the majority of the Jews were loyal to them. They were called the separate ones because they were very careful. And in those days, there were a lot of laws that we don't follow today. Nowadays, just to put this in perspective, we can keep about 1/3 of God's original biblical laws. We might know there are 613 laws in the Torah, biblically, and we can only keep about 1/3, because 2/3 have to do with the temple, have to do with ritual purity and impurity, have to do with being in Israel, the majority of the Jews living in Israel. All of those factors we don't have now. We don't have a temple. The majority of Jews are not in Israel. And since the destruction of the temple, we have no concept of ritual purity. We're all considered impure, ritually. So therefore, when we learn these laws, I'm just bringing this to explain the concept. When we learn these laws of ritual purity, they are really difficult because we don't do them. Meaning there's a lot of laws we follow that if you're not aware of them, they're so complicated. How do you remember? How do you remember to eat like this? How do you remember to do all the laws of Sabbath? How do you remember all the laws of kosher? But we live like this. So if we live like this, it's our life. So we just do it. It's normal to us. So there's countless laws of ritual purity. How one stays truly pure, which was very relevant in the times of the temple, because only if you're pure can you go to the temple. Only if you're pure can you eat certain of the holy foods that were the foods of the people, but could only be eaten in a state of ritual purity. And if you're not really careful, it's very easy to fall into impurity. And if you're in impurity, you can't go to the temple. If you're impurity and you eat the pure foods, it's a sin and you're transgressing and violating the foods, and many, many complicated laws. So since the laws were so complicated, the Jews that kept the laws, that knew the laws, that followed the laws, were called Perushim, Pharisees, because Perushim means separate, because they were careful to separate themselves, literally, physically, from people that did not follow these laws. They weren't doing it to be exclusive. They weren't doing it to say, we're better than you. They were doing it because they knew if you don't know them very well, if you're not very learned and very observant, for sure you're ritually impure. And if we come in contact with you, we're going to be ritually impure as well. So it was just sort of a practical reality that they had to separate themselves from the Jews that didn't keep the laws. So that's why they were called Perushim, the separate ones, because they kept the laws, though other Jews didn't. This was the majority of the Jewish people, by the way. The majority were loyal to God, loyal to the sages, and loyal to these very complicated laws. That's one group, the Perushim. The next group that we're going to talk about a lot was a minority of the Jews with a completely disproportionate power, because they had a lot of money and political influence. And they were called the Tzedukim. If you remember, I taught you about this quite a number of weeks ago, that there were two students of sages that went off, Tzadok and Bitus. I don't know if you remember them. They were two sages. They weren't sages themselves. They were studying among the sages, and they deviated. And they turned off from the sages, and they created two groups of followers. Tzadok, his followers were called the Tzedukim, and Bitus, his followers were called the Bitusim. Originally, there were two different groups, the Tzedukim and the Bitusim, from Tzadok and Bitus, these two contemporary students that both of them turned off. At this point already, it's many years later, the whole group is called Tzedukim. In English, they're called the Sadducees, the Sadducees, and in Hebrew, they're called the Tzedukim. Tzedukim because they're the followers of, descendants of the followers of Tzadok, again, Tzadok and Bitus, who went off. So you really see from here the danger when somebody turns away from God and he tries to influence other people, how horrifically detrimental it is. In other words, it's interesting because at this point, we don't call them the Hellenists anymore, even though they were followers of the Greek culture. But that whole love affair with Hellenism sort of died over all the wars with Syria. Like all the Jews sort of got it that we're Jews, we don't want to be Syrians, we don't want to be Egyptians, we want to be Greek Jews. So none of these people, at this point, once Simon had gained the complete independence, we don't find, as we found unfortunately earlier, that the Jews were trying to get the Syrians to control us again because they so much wanted the Greek culture that we want to lose our independence. No, the Jews at this point were happy to be independent, but they wanted to be a Sadducee culture, which basically meant a culture devoid of God. A culture where we reject all the words of the sages, which what we call, when we have Torah, we have two parts of Torah. We have the written Torah and we have what we call the oral Torah. Nowadays, of course, the oral Torah is written down, but originally, as we've touched on, this concept that this tremendous, vast knowledge of explaining the written Torah and explaining how we live God's word and keep all of his commandments was all transmitted orally from teacher to students, from teacher to students to teacher to students for generations. Until, of course, we spoke about a little bit, it had to be recorded already by the men of the Great Assembly. We discussed that. And we're going to come to, at the end, after the destruction of the Second Temple, how it's completely written in what's called the Mishnah, and a few hundred years later in the Talmud. And of course, now we have those volumes and volumes and volumes of Talmud. If you've ever seen a complete set of Talmud, this is all the transcribing of the oral tradition, of the oral law. So the Tzedukim completely rejected the oral law. I'm not going to say they completely rejected God. I mean, they sort of did, but they didn't officially claim that. What they officially claimed was they rejected the sages and they rejected the oral law. So if it's written in the Torah, if it's written in the Bible, we'll sort of follow it, like we'll pretend to follow it. But anything else, we reject completely. No, we don't give anyone power over us. No sages. We will not submit to any authority. That's the essence point. We're not going to submit and give the sages any authority over us. So anything the sages say, all of the oral tradition, which is how we know how to live as Jews, we reject that completely. And unfortunately, this was, well, thank God, the minority of the Jews, but these were the rich and powerful Jews. They had a lot of political power, they had a lot of financial power, and they were generally the ones hanging out with the kings and hanging out with whatever foreign powers there were. So they exerted a tremendous control. Even the vast majority of the populace didn't accept them at all. And again, because they were the rich and powerful ones and they were hanging out by the palace, that's how the Chashmonai leaders turned so quickly. You know, again, we see here this, again, practical and horrible reality of, even if you start out good, but if you hang out with people that are not, it corrupts. So we can look at the Chashmonaim and saying they took on a lot of power that they shouldn't have taken. So that fatal sin led to the downfall. We could say because they had power, and power corrupts, unfortunately, unless you're very nullified to God. So because they didn't have that nullification to God, the power corrupted them. And that's why they became so off from the roots of their fathers and totally left God's will. And also a third obvious point is the people hanging around the palace are these rich, powerful tzaddukim. And you get influenced by your company. So even if they started off saying, no, we don't believe in these people. Yeah, they hang out in the palace because they're rich and powerful, but no, we know that's not the road to go. But in the end of the day, if these are the people you hang with, these are the people that affect you. So the philosophy, the perspective of the tzaddukim was absorbed, unfortunately, by the Chashmonaim until the Chashmonaim themselves became very violent, aggressive tzaddukim. And again, when I say violent and aggressive, very hating of the sages. Because that was this essence tzadduki point, again, going all the way back to Tzadok and Bitos, the founders of the movement, who rejected the teachings and, became their own, self-appointed authorities. We don't hear from the sages. We just stick to the original words written in the Torah, and that's it. So that hatred of the sages continued in all these generations and was absorbed, unfortunately, by the descendants of the Chashmonaim. There were two other groups. So those are the main groups we're going to be talking about. That will also, at that time, there were also two other groups of Jews. One were called the Am Haaretz. Am Haaretz literally means the people of the land. It's a term we use till today to mean simple, ignorant people. The Am Haaretz, the simple, ignorant, common man, they were orthodox. Orthodox is the word we use today. They were observant of God's will to the best of their ability, meaning they followed God's will, they followed the words of the sages, they hung with the Perushim, so to speak, but they were ignorant. They were Am Haaretz, means they were the ignorant people, the peasants. And as such, the Perushim did not connect with them, because remember, the Perushim are very observant, and they're like, if we stick with these people, they're for sure ritually impure because they don't know. It's very hard. You got to be really knowledgeable of lots of complex laws to stay pure. So if we sit at the same table with them, if we're eating the same food as them, they're impure, we're going to become impure. And then we can't go to the temple, and then we can't eat all the ritually pure foods. And if we eat the ritually pure foods, we're defiling them as well, and so forth and so on and so forth and so on. It's complicated laws. So therefore, the Perushim, the Pharisees generally did not associate with the Am Haaretz, with the more common man, which led to a bit of a strain there in the relationships between the two groups, because the common man felt like, what are we, second-class citizens? But again, the Perushim weren't doing it because they're elitists. They were doing it sort of as a practical reality. If we eat with you and we befriend you and we socialize with you, you're impure for sure. We're going to become impure too. So both groups, the Perushim and the Am Haaretz, were both observant of God's will. They both were obedient to the sages. They both believed in God and in the oral law and in keeping all the traditions and rituals. But because the Am Haaretz were commoners that didn't know there was a separation between the two groups. There was a fourth group, which was the smallest group, called the Essenes. It's actually like, whatever, maybe the word today from it in English, in Asusim in the Hebrew, and the Esseneses in the English. They were a very small, I guess we would call them today a fringe group, that believed in a very, very, very ascetic life, which means they did not live with the people. They did not live in the towns or the cities, whatever cities were in those days. They lived in the caves. They basically like had bare minimal physical sustenance. And I guess you'd call them sort of like a cult. You know, they were just like, they believed in lots of things, like seemingly very spiritual, but not really Jewish. In other words, sort of goes back to another a lesson we can learn from them, is that spirituality doesn't necessarily mean God. Meaning we only eat this food, and we make this blessing before it, and we make this blessing after it, and this times of day we can't eat, and this times of day we have lots of ritualized laws, and every single one of those laws connects us to God. Well, they don't feel so holy and spiritual. It's a bunch of laws. True, but these laws were given by God, and these laws are called mitzvahs. And a mitzvah, commandment, means the root etymology of mitzvah is tzavsa, which means a bond between you and God. So when God said, eat this, and eat it now, and don't eat it now, and eat it with this blessing before, and eat it with this blessing after, and say this, and don't say this, and think this, and don't think this, and wear this, and don't wear this, all of those laws are mitzvahs, are bonds between us and God. The way to access true godliness. But spirituality, you can feel very spiritual and holy and do whatever you want, and doesn't mean it's going to lead you anywhere toward God. Because God's infinite and you're finite. So why should your own self-created spirituality go anywhere besides in your own headspace? So this splinter group, I'm saying I don't know if there was a cult leader, there might have been, might not have been, I don't know, but I'm saying there obviously was some leader that led this group, but they was almost in that sense of like, they did not lead a life as Judaism says to lead it, because that's not God's vision. God's vision isn't like, the ultimate purpose of man is to live in a cave and have the most minimalistic physical existence and, meditate all day on God. God said, I'm not asking you to do that. I don't want you to do that. I want you to live a physical life. I want you to get married. I want you to have children. I want you to enjoy all the physical beauty of this world that's permissible and use it to serve God. So they sort of like splintered off and made their own like whatever. And again, practicing this extreme minimalistic life, they sort of created their own religion, if you will. I mean, they didn't view it as their own religion, but it wasn't Judaism, that's for sure. And their life had no basis in Jewish laws. Some historians speculated if Yashka was a member of this group. Again, I'm not saying definitively he was or he wasn't. It's something that historians debate or speculate on this point. In 1947, there were scrolls that were found in caves in this area where they lived, containing like apocalyptic visions, which again is speculated to be from this origin, from this group, from that time space, from that time period that these documents, these parchments were discovered. It's believed that it was probably from this group, because it's not prophecies. It's not Jewish per se. Obviously, it's in the land of the Jews, but it seems more it was their own like visions coming from the type of life they led, as versus a God-given vision. So again, I think what we gain from this is the understanding that the road to God is how God directs, and that's the only road to God. And it might seem there are of course many parts of Judaism that are very spiritual. And you feel the spirituality, and you feel the holiness, and you feel the godliness. But at the end of the day, you're connected to God because this is God's will, and this is what he wants you to do. And when you do what God wants, you're bound up with God. And when you go your own road, like you have numerous groups in India doing this to this day, when you go your own road, you're not going to wind up by God. So these were the 4 groups. So the reason I'm so to speak, going to these 4 groups is because I now want to speak of what happened, and I'm going to use the term Tzeduki a lot. So I want it to be very clear what we mean by this. So any questions on the 4 groups or anything else I said until this point, or any other questions? Okay. So here we have now, okay, so Simon was brutally murdered by his son-in-law, as were his 2 sons with him at the time. Yochana Horkanus fled. Yochana Horkanus comes back. Yochana Horkanus drives out Ptolemy, or Ptolemy probably ran away because obviously he would have killed him. And Yochana Horkanus now takes over. So Yochana Horkanus is like this ultimate example of the tragedy of the Chashmonaim. Because Simon at least stayed loyal to God. You know, he reigned for 7 years and he was loyal to God all 7 years. There was a bit of friction there, you might say, in that which became much more augmented under Yochana Horkanus. In other words, Simon was righteous. He was righteous enough to know that he was doing was wrong. It might sound like a oxymoron thought, but Simon was righteous enough to know that he should not be on the throne. No, he never declared himself king, but de facto he was ruling as king, and he was wrong. And he obviously knew that what he was doing was not what the sages would want him to do. They didn't start up with him. I don't know why they did it. Maybe they felt they didn't have the power. Maybe they felt, this is the savior of the Jewish people. Or I don't know what their calculations were, why they didn't. But they didn't. And he reigned knowing what he was doing was wrong, but still doing it. Like sort of going with the flow. Now we have Yochana Horkanus. Yochana Horkanus was considered very righteous. As we said last week, again, the sages, it's disputed in the Talmud, either for 40 years or for 80 years he was a high priest. And as I explained, to be the high priest, that means every year in Yom Kippur, you go into the Holy of Holies and you come out alive. And if you're not worthy, you don't come out alive. During this reign of the Second Temple, there were 300 high priests. Okay, the reign of the Second Temple was 420 years. In 420 years, there were 300 high priests. That means if you take away the 80 years, if we give Yochana Horkanus 80 years, that means in 340 years, there were 299 high priests. Most of them never made it past a year, which we've discussed before and we'll discuss again, that we see that these people were so unworthy of the term, and that's why every year when Yom Kippur came and they went to the Holy of Holies, they died. Why would they go in if they know they're going to die? It's something we can't really understand, but they so much wanted godliness, even though on their terms, and therefore were so unworthy of it, and therefore died. Literally, they would tie a rope around the body of the high priest, because you can't walk into the Holy of Holies, and if he doesn't make it alive, we got to pull him out. And most years, that's what happened. But Yochana Horkanus never died in the Holy of Holies. Either 40 years, 40 times, or 80 years, 80 times, he went in and out of the Holy of Holies. He was truly, truly, truly righteous. No questions. Okay, we're not gonna, there's a lot of details here. But Yochana Horkanus, again, once he became king, he was king for, I believe, 31 years. He never took the title king either, but he led the Jews as king for 31 years. Which, of course, at that time, he was both the high priest and the leader of the Jews. And for most of those 31 years, he was righteous. He only went off the last year of his life. Could you imagine? For 40 or 80 years, a high priest. For 31 years, a leader, a king. And for all those years, he was righteous. And the last year of his life, he flipped completely. He is the person on whom our sages created the saying based on his life. But of course, it's not just for him. It's decontextualized for all of us. Do not believe in yourself until the day you die. That's a pretty strong sentence. What do you mean? I've been Orthodox my whole life. Or I became Orthodox, I was living a life and I turned to God and I sacrificed so much. Don't believe myself till the day of my God. What do you think I'm gonna do? Start eating not kosher? Start violating the Sabbath? Or what do you think's gonna happen to me? Do not believe in yourself until the day of you die. Because Yochana Horkanus was so righteous. And the last year of his life, he turned completely the other direction. So what were the roots of this? How did he flip completely 180 degrees in the last year of his life? So even though this was the last year of his life, but as I said, I believe he reigned for 31 years. Yeah, 31 years. Successful, righteous. He was a good ruler. He was a successful ruler. He was a righteous king. But there was always this tension between him and the sages. Meaning, even though he was ruling and the high priest, and nobody said anything to him, but he knew that they knew he shouldn't be the ruler. And he knew he shouldn't be the ruler. He was a righteous person. He shouldn't have been the ruler. And he knew he shouldn't have been the ruler. Well, I'm not calling myself king. You know, what's interesting, something else you learn from this, of course, is the stories we tell ourselves, right? So you can ask yourself, I said Shimeon was righteous. Yochana Horkanus was righteous. They were righteous. They observed God's laws. They were high priests. How were they doing something in complete violation of God's will? So you tell yourself stories. So the story they were telling themselves is, I never took on the title king. God said only from Judah can be the king. Only from the descendants of Solomon, the son of David. I'm not king. If a descendant would come up and demand the throne, I'd give it to him. I'm not king, but no such descendant is coming up. So I'm just taking care of the affairs of the country. And if a king showed up, I would definitely, I for sure would, but hey, no king showing up. It's not my problem. So this is a story you tell yourself. This is a fabrication. It's not true. But you sort of live with your conscience by telling yourself these stories. So Simon, obviously, for 7 years, he told himself this story. I'm not calling myself king. I'm not claiming I'm the king. I never took the title. And Yochana Horkanus for 31 years is telling himself this story. I'm not king. I'm not doing anything against God's will. I'm a righteous person. I'm the high priest. I've been in the Holy of Holies 40 or 80 times. I'm very righteous. I just happen to be doing something in complete violation of God's will. So therefore, for all of these years, there was this tension between him and the sages, because he knew he was telling himself a story. I mean, of course, on the surface, he believed the story he was telling himself. But under the surface, he knew he was telling himself a story. And he knew the sages, even though they were very polite to him and very nice to him and very respectful to him, but he knew they completely disapproved of what he was doing, which is true. They did completely disapprove of what he was doing. So therefore, as his life went on, this tension between him and the sages got stronger and stronger and stronger. At the same time, as I was mentioning before, as I wanted therefore to explain the concepts, there were these tzedukim. Remember, these are the rich, powerful minority of the Jews who are anti-sages, anti the oral law, anti-following God's will. We're going to just take the words that's written in the Bible and we're going to interpret them as we want, and that's it. So the tzedukim are the people hanging out in the palace. So Yochana Horkanus, who is righteous, is surrounded by these people for the past 30 years. So obviously, as I said before, you get influenced by the people you hang with. That's just the fact. It's a fact we should all absorb and understand. It's very serious. Yochana Horkanus was so righteous, but for 30 years he's surrounded by tzedukim, because those are the people that have the power and the money are in the palace. So 30 years of influence wore him down. So at the end of his life, this is a tragedy. At the end of his life, he became a tzedukim. At the end of his life, he completely broke off with the sages. Now, before that, there was something he did. I'm not judging him, or I don't know how, we don't know how God judges, but there was something he did that was very wrong, but seemingly was an innocent mistake, but a very tragic mistake that actually led to the demise of the entire Chashmonai line and a lot of other tragedies. He had conquered the area south of the area of the Jews by the Edomites, descendants of Esau. And fearing that these people would rebel against them, he thought the way to overcome it was to make them all Jewish. So then they're not going to fight against him because, hey, they're part of this nation. We can't take you into the Jewish nation unless you're Jews. So, of course, nowadays in the state of Israel, you don't have to be Jewish to be part of the Jewish nation, Jewish country. But in those days, if you're part of the Jewish country, you're a Jew. So the way he got around this, which again has very modern ramifications. We can hear the resonating waves of this in the state of Israel today. He said, well, we'll just make them all Jewish. So he forcibly converted all these Edomites to be Jewish. Now, of course, this was a complete mistake. This was a complete going against Jewish law, because as I'm sure we all know, we never forcibly convert anyone. It's the opposite. We discourage converts. And we do whatever we can to keep people from converting. I mean, not whatever we can, maybe that's an exaggeration. But we definitely discourage and discourage and discourage converts until we find out they're really, really, really sincere. And he did the opposite. He converted these people, again, as a military strategy for his country. But again, same concept. We see the same mirror principle here. He thought he was doing something that was going to help. Not only spiritually was a devastation, but physically it was a devastation. And from these converted Edomites came Herod, who destroyed his entire line, murdered every one of his descendants, and seized the throne and put us under the Romans. So again, you see that we think, I could be really righteous and serve God, or I could just be more pragmatic and do what's good for me, or good practically. And you see, when people try to do what's good for them and good practically, not only is it spiritual devastation, it doesn't work out practically either. What works out is following God's will. And if you're not following God's will, it's not going to work out. So at the end of his life, so now we have, so the sages, first of all, he knows the sages are upset with him because he has a throne, unofficially has a throne. Then when he converted the Edomites, the sages came out against him. They said, I mean, this is complete sacrilegious. This is complete going against all of Jewish law. It's going to create a tremendous number of problems, which it did. The sages, I mean, it's against law, and it's very problematic to have all these non-Jews now saying they're Jews in the country, which is exactly what it did do. So the sages came out against him. So wow, now all of his, if you will call it insecurities or displeasure with the sages came out when the sages are going against him and telling him what he did wrong. So therefore, at the end of his life, he embraced the Tzedukי perspective. And it was such a tragedy because he lived a lifetime of righteousness. But because of his suspicion, the paranoia, which made him pray for the Tzedukim who were talking to him about how the sages are against him, that paranoia, and because of his lust for power that he allowed himself to be king for 31 years instead of turning it over to a descendant of David. And also conquering the Edomites was a lust for power, because what did he go there for at all? He didn't need to. They were strong. They would never have been able to take over Judea, but he just wanted to be like, unfortunately, the Gentile kings were at that time. You know, of course, that's until modern times. Of course, any strong country has imperialistic desires and wants to conquer more countries. So because he wanted more power, therefore he conquered the Edomites, and therefore he converted them, which led to the sages coming against him, which made him pray for the Tzedukim that were saying that, oh, the sages are against you, the sages are against you, the sages are against you, the sages are against you. Why are you sticking with the sages? Stick with us. They're against you. We're for you. We love you. They hate you. And he heard this enough that he actually believed it. And he became a Tzeduki and chased away. And actually the sages had to flee because he, God forbid, would have murdered the sages. But they literally had to flee from Yochana Horkanus, who was so great and holy for his entire life until the final year. From which, again, we see this very strong moral lesson. You can never trust yourself. You can never believe, I've arrived, now I can relax. You've never arrived. We're always coming closer to God. God's infinite, we're finite, we're never done the journey. And as we walk closer and closer and closer and closer, we still have to be very vigilant, because our evil inclination never leads us until we're a complete tzaddik, completely righteous, which obviously even Yochanan Horkanus, who was a high priest for 40 or 80 years, never attained that level. Okay, so we will stop at this point. Yochanan Horkanus dies, unfortunately, right after he destroys his lifetime of righteousness by this becoming this Tzeduki. He left instructions that his wife, his widow, should take over. His widow was very righteous and stayed very righteous, and we'll discuss her next week. But that wasn't listened to, as we'll explain, and his son Yanai took over, and that led to a lot of other things that that led to tremendous destruction among the Jewish people. It's interesting, just with Yochana Horkanus, there's a famous piece of the Talmud discussing a tremendous sinner, a horrible sinner. Literally went around the whole world, had relationships with every prostitute in the world. And at the end, and at a certain point, he was so low that he went to a certain prostitute and she refused to have relationships with him. She said, I won't have relationships with anyone like you. Ugh. He realized, like, whoa, I'm too low for a prostitute? Oh my gosh. And it's a long story. I'm saying it very, very briefly because I know we're over time. But I just want to connect it to Yochana Horkanus. And he actually did a complete repentance. He repented. He felt like, oh my gosh, where have I fallen to? What have I become that a prostitute wouldn't have a relationship with me? And it says he went alone, isolated, and he cried, and he cried, and he cried, and he repented, and he repented, and he repented until he died. And when he died, it said that a heavenly voice came out and said that Rav so-and-so is welcome into the heavenly courts. He's welcomed up into heaven. And the question is, what do you mean he's welcomed into heaven? I mean, we see he repented, but he hadn't served God at all for his entire life. He'd been an aggressive sinner. So where does he get, what merits does he have to enter heaven? So one explanation on this story is that this sinner was a reincarnation of Yochana Horkanus. Yochana Horkanus had a lifetime of merits. He was a high priest 40 or 80 years. He was very righteous until the end. If he hadn't messed it up at the end, he would have been considered one of the best kings the Jewish people ever had. Not king, but unfortunately shouldn't have been king, but great spiritual leader. He had a lifetime of merits that he destroyed by his sins at the end of his life. So he was never allowed into the heavenly abodes. He came down in a reincarnation into this sinner that sinned his entire life. But with the repentance he did at the end of his life, he rectified all the damage. And now all the godliness accrued by Yochana Horkanus, now this soul can truly enter Gan Eden, can truly enter the heavenly abodes with the merits of Yochana Horkanus and the repentance of the sinner. Okay, so we will end at this point, and we will continue, God willing, next week. Or perhaps we'll discuss Rosh Hashanah next week. We'll see. It's a week before Rosh Hashanah, or maybe a bit of both, with Yanai, the son of Yochana Horkanus. Have a wonderful week, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Cyril. Thank you.
Thank you, Manufa.
Thank you.